Howdy, folks. Radical Russ, your red state refugee here, and I got to take a moment to rant about something I hear on the internet and see on TV all the time from people who claim that the Republicans and the Democrats are all the same. They're just two sides of the same coin, two wings of the same bird. And I think we've got a case here of people hating the players and not hating the game. The game has a lot to do with why the Republicans and the Democrats are the way they are. Saying they're both the same, though, elides a lot of differences between the two parties. It's kind of like saying LeBron James and Ron Artest are both basketball players because they both pass and dribble and shoot, except LeBron James is passing to his teammates and helping win a game. Ron Artest is running up into the stands to beat up the fans. There is a difference between the two. And as far as I'm concerned, maybe they are somewhat alike, but if they are two wings of the same bird, I prefer the bird that doesn't shit on racial and sexual minorities. And as far as them being two sides of the same coin, well, we got data to back this up. I prefer the side of the coin that actually makes more coin. It really comes down to what you think about government. Democrats in general think of government as all of us cooperating together in order to try to solve some problems. With Republicans, on the other hand, they tend to believe that government is the problem. It's the impediment to people being able to cooperate and get things done. As Grover Norquist was so fond of saying, he wants to be able to shrink government down to the size where you can drown it in a bathtub. Doesn't sound like cooperation to me. Democrats in general believe that the government can and should help the people, whereas Republicans tend to look at government as something to control the people and as something to be feared. As Ronald Reagan infamously said, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But what's this government all about anyway? Didn't we all agree that we founded a government for 6 basic reasons as laid out in our Declaration of Independence? I mean, we said that government is formed in order to form a more perfect union. We were a bunch of separate states with a bunch of separate laws, and we wanted to combine together, form a more perfect union, find better ways of getting along with each other. But I see Republicans all the time fomenting divisions between the states, trying to encourage a view of the 10th Amendment that would allow states to be less unified. We agreed that we'd form a government to establish justice, and yet we see the Republicans these days wanting to shut down justice, especially when it comes to holding the former president accountable for the insurrection of January 6th. And speaking of January 6th, ensuring domestic tranquility, we founded a government so that we could all be peaceful. And I know the right-wingers watching this will say, what about all the riots with Black Lives Matter and so? As if fomenting an insurrection to stop the peaceful transfer of power is just like looting a TV out of a Best Buy. Promote the general welfare? Well, that's all about helping the people with housing and food and medical care and infrastructure. And every step of the way, we see Republicans trying to thwart progress on that front. How many times did Trump announce there'd be an infrastructure week while Joe Biden actually got an infrastructure bill passed and signed, boots on the ground, shovels in the dirt? And to secure our blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, the right to be free, to live where we like, to be able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, to our posterity, our future generations, we see what Republicans have done with respect to ignoring, downplaying, and even rejecting the science of climate change. But let's go back to that thought about them being two sides of the same coin. You know, we can actually measure Republican administrations against Democratic administrations on the metrics of unemployment, job creation, the growth of the gross domestic product, our recessions, our economic recessions, our budget deficit, and the performance of the stock market. Let's take a look. Here's a chart of the unemployment rates at the beginning and the end of the presidential terms, going all the way back to Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1961. Well, Kennedy from 61, but Johnson from 65 on up. And the time there is split pretty evenly between Republicans and Democrats. 30 years to 28 years, I think, is the value there. And just looking at this chart, we can see that unemployment is always lower during the the Democratic administrations. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Democrats are better job creators. Looking at the job creation chart, we can see during the Democratic administration, many jobs are created. Those are in thousands, those figures there. So we're talking 142 million jobs at the beginning of Joe Biden's term, already up to 152 million jobs. More jobs created during Biden's term than any presidential term, Republican or Democrat. Looking at GDP growth, the gross domestic product of our country, you can tell that the best GDP growth has taken place in 5 out of the last 6 administrations that were Democratic, as compared to Reagan being the only one up there amongst all those blue bars. And when it comes to economic recessions, out of the last 11 recessions we've faced, 10 of them have been at the beginning of a Republican presidential term. The overall statistics economically for Democratic administrations versus Republican administrations couldn't be more clear. We can also add in the budget deficit is better handled under Democratic administrations, and the stock market posts greater gains under Democratic administrations. So if they're two sides of the same coin, why not flip the coin to the side that actually makes you some more coin? And of course, a look at Republican disgovernance wouldn't be complete without charting the devastating effect of this one man, President Ronald Wilson Reagan. Just about any bad thing you can point out about the United States of America compared to our like market democracies around the world, like Western Europe, can be traced to Ronald Wilson Reagan. Here we have a graph of life expectancy versus healthcare expenditures. There's us and the rest of the world, and they're all getting older and older. Their life expectancies are increasing, and yet they're not having to spend near as much money per capita on healthcare as we do. That's the bottom red line there. And as you can see, where Ronald Reagan shows up, we see healthcare expenditures massively increasing, moving farther to the right, and yet life expectancy not rising upward like the rest of the democracies that we compete with. You can take a look at the top percentage wage earners versus the lowest percentage wage earners. Again, at the beginning of Reagan's term, we see that we've had a decline in the bottom 50% of wage earners' income relative to the top 1% of U.S. wage earners. The money is trickling up to the rich. Trickle-down economics was always voodoo economics, as George H.W. Bush once so classically observed. And as far as getting an education to try to move yourself up in the world, we see how everything changed with Ronald Reagan. On this chart, we're looking at a blue line, which gives us the increase in tuition and fees at university. We have a green line, which is the income increase, the median income increase, about what the middle is of America. And then on the bottom, that red line is your minimum wage increase. And from 1970 through 1980, all three of those things increased at about the same rate. So a minimum wage earner or a median wage earner could still keep up with the increasing costs of education. Since Ronald Wilson Reagan in 1981, all those lines diverge, where the cost of going to school now has tripled compared to what those other benchmarks show. We can also take a look at the chart of income gains since World War II. Again, the bottom 20%, the median, and the top 5% from about 1945 to 1980, all equally shared in the gains of income. As companies did better, everybody did better. A rising tide lifted all boats. But since Ronald Wilson Reagan, we can see the divergence where that red line, the top 5%, get a larger increase in the benefits of income gains. But then we see the median and the bottom 20% slacking, falling behind the top 5%. Again, thanks to the policies that Reagan brought to fore. And the alleged party of fiscal responsibility, we can see how the United States debt as both real dollars and a percentage of GDP was going down all the way until we got to Ronald Reagan. And since then, just increased. Now, the slight decreases you see there in the 90s, that would be Bill Clinton right there. Slight decrease you see there later on at the end of the chart, again, that would be Barack Obama. So when one side of the coin is so obviously disastrous for the economy, at least as it refers to poor and middle class people, how in the world does that side of the coin keep getting elected? Well, it's because we live in a country that is run by we, the people, and all people are created equal. The only problem is corporations are people, my friend. Corporations have been declared people. These immortal, transnational, hyper-wealthy, non-corporeal, cannibalistic sociopaths are people like you and me. Yeah, think about that. Corporations are immortal. You and I have a fixed lifespan, so we care about what's going to happen in the immediate and near long-term future. Corporations don't care. They're immortal. They're transnational. They don't have to live in one place. You and I have to pick a place to live, and that air has to be clean for us to breathe, and the water has to be clean for us to drink. And they're hyper wealthy. They have powers that we can't even imagine. And they're non-corporeal. They don't need air. They don't need water. They don't need food. They don't care if the temperature's 120 degrees. They're cannibalistic. They can actually consume other corporate people to make themselves even more hyper wealthy and transnational. And they're sociopathic. Under the law, they are required to do whatever it takes within the law to maximize value for the shareholders, whether that hurts or helps the people. The other problem we have is that the rich people in this country are more equal than the poor people. Sure, we all get one vote, but thanks to Citizens United, rich people get to pool all their money together in super PACs to help influence elections in the ways that you and I and our little meager free speech can't compete with. And the way our electoral system is set up, rural white people are more equal than the rest of us. And when it comes to those transnational, sociopathic, cannibalistic corporations that have an outside influence in our government, who is running those corporations? Overwhelmingly Republicans. 50% of all corporate boards are made up of Republicans, compared to about a quarter Democrats and a quarter independents. It skews heavily male. It skews heavily white. Of course, you ask these corporate boards if there should be more diversity on the corporate boards, and those Republicans on those corporate boards are overwhelmingly opposed to it. So we have an institutional roadblock that keeps corporate people largely white and Republican, and then they use their dollars accordingly to purchase the senator or congressman to do their bidding. And when I say rich people are more equal than others, there's actual data to back this up. A couple of researchers took a look at about 20 years worth of policy preferences based on whether poor people wanted a certain policy, middle class people wanted a certain policy, and rich people wanted a certain policy. And the graph we show here shows those three groups. Now, the dotted line is your 10th percentile, your poorest people. Your dashed line, middle class people at the 50th percentile. And the solid line, 90th percentile, would be your richest. Along the bottom axis is the percentage of people in those groups who would favor a certain change in policy, from 0 to 100%. Along the left axis, the probability they're going to get what they want. From 0% and the top of the axis, about 0.6, that's about 60% chance that they would get what they want. So as you look at this graph, when poor people, middle class people, and rich people all agree that they would like a certain policy changed, they generally get what they want kind of compared to how much they want it. Say at about 20% of the time, if 20% of the people want to change, then there's about a 20% chance it's going to happen. And if 80%, 85%, 90% of the people want to change, it's about half the time, up to about 60% of the time, that's going to happen. Now, it's not a perfect correlation on issue to issue, but more of an aggregate as far as what people want and whether or not they're going to get it. But when you change the views and you graph this compared to if poor people don't want something, but rich people do, or poor people do want something and rich people don't, that is, when the views of the poor and the rich disagree, who wins? Looking at this graph shows you that if poor people are about 0% to 10% wanting something to change, it'll happen about 30% of the time. And if 100% of the poor people want something to change, it'll change about 30% of the time. That is to say, what poor people want has very little bearing on whether or not something changes. But you look at that other line for the rich people, if rich people want something to change, moving over to the far right, it's far more likely it's going to change. And this holds true even when you look at it comparing middle class people. What middle class people want from 0 to 100% makes very little difference as to whether that change is going to happen in Congress. But what rich people want still maintains that upward slope that they're generally going to get what they want. Break that down by income groups, and you can see on the left-hand side, we have what the 10% want, what the 30% want, what the 50% want, and what the 70% want of those changes, and how likely it's going to change if rich people don't want it. And as you can see, those first few bars are actually at almost zero or negative. And even when you get up to the 70th percentile of somewhat rich people, upper class, you'd say, even they don't have much of a chance. But you look at the right side of that graph. That's what the 90% want compared to the 10, the 30, the 50, and the 70. And they almost overwhelmingly are up above 40 or 50% of chance that they're going to get what they want compared to all the other demographics. So again, rich people are more equal than others. And then I pointed out that rural white people are more equal than others. And that's illustrated by the US Senate and the way our electoral college works. On the left, we have California, a state with roughly 39.5, almost 40 million people. On the right, we have 14 states in the United States, almost all red states with the exception of Colorado. Those 14 states combined have about 40 million people, 39.9. And yet they have an outsized amount of power. Those 14 states get 28 senators. They get over a quarter of the voice in the United States Senate compared to 2 senators for the state of California. And when it comes to selecting the president, who again controls selection of the Supreme Court, along with those senators, you have 55 electoral votes for California versus 79 electoral votes for those 14 sparse rural states. And the makeup of those states. California is a highly diverse state with only 35% of its population being solely white, non-Hispanic. Whereas in the 14 states that I've shown on the right, 73% of the people in those states are white, non-Hispanic. So again, rural whites are more equal than others. They get a larger say in the Senate, a larger say for the president, and a larger say in who picks the Supreme Court. Now, before I go on, I do want to take a moment to address a point on this that I've had in the past when I've mentioned the systemic racism in the Senate and the Electoral College. And one of the comments I get back from people is, well, that's not, you can't judge it being racist by where people choose to live. Well, let's talk about where people choose to live. First of all, African Americans did not choose to concentrate in the South and in certain parts of cities. First of all, of course, slavery, brought them all to the American South with not much say in where they were going to be. And remember, after we ended slavery, we were going to give them all 40 acres and a mule, and that never happened. How much greater would Black participation and Black say in our government be if they'd all actually gotten the chance to be landowners? Then we've got the concept of eminent domain. When a city wants to put a freeway through, they wreck the Black neighborhood and they put the freeway through that neighborhood and then split that neighborhood up and attach it to other districts so that then it dilutes the Black voice in that city or that district or that county or that state. Then, of course, even once we've segregated black folks into their own little parts of cities, if they start doing well economically, historically, we had a tendency to burn down their towns and firebomb them. Look up the Tulsa race riots, for example. Then, when we had the GI Bill and FHA loans that were coming out, there was the practice of redlining, where certain neighborhoods were redlined as the only places black folks could get houses, and they were denied loans to go out to other places. And of course, the rampant Jim Crow throughout the United States that meant certain areas of the country were just no-go zones for African American people, including my home state of Oregon, which was actually constitutionally founded as a no blacks state. That's another thing you ought to Google. And of course, Native Americans didn't choose to be concentrated in Oklahoma and on various reservations in the 50 states. We have, of course, had the history of ethnic cleansing from the time we started handing them smallpox-laden blankets and then started massacring all their bison across the Great Plains to try to deprive them of food and shelter, and then concentrating and marching them on the trails of tears and concentrating them in these enclaves of such rampant poverty. You go on a native reservation even today and you're in a third world country. Then, of course, we had the Indian Removal Acts, the Dawes Act, all of these legislation that was designed to disempower and disenfranchise Native Americans. Between 1945 and 1968, administratively, there were just 100 tribes that were written off. They just didn't exist. They didn't qualify for some reason. And we could say the same for Asian Americans. They didn't choose to be concentrated in Chinatowns and living out in the West. There were all sorts of naturalization acts and Chinese exclusion acts that restricted who could move in, where they could live. Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans also faced the same kind of race riots. The Chinatown in Seattle was burned down once it was starting to get successful. And of course, in 1942, when we had the Japanese internment camps, a lot of those Japanese Americans lost their homes and their properties. I mean, we could go on and on about how a lot of Americans didn't get to choose where they live. So when people come at me with this two wings of the same bird, I wonder what kind of bird they're looking at, because only one of these wings is shitting all over the Constitution and shitting all over the rights of sexual and racial minorities and ethnic minorities, and that's the Republican side. I mean, they claim to love the Constitution so much, but really about the only part of it they give a damn about is the Second Amendment. They're shitting all over the First Amendment. They want to pervert the plain meaning of the separation of church and state to try to infect the church into every aspect of our lives. They want to curtail our rights to free speech by saying what you can or can't do to a flag. Funny how they're so concerned about flag burners, but they'll put one on the back of their pickup truck until it's a ragged little scrap of cloth a foot wide. They want to clamp down on our rights to protest our government for redress of grievances when they put all lives splatter and no one cares about your protest sticker on their big ass pickup trucks. They're the ones that want to shit all over the Fourth Amendment, destroy our right to be free of search and seizure from the government. They're the ones supporting the stops and frisks and the chokeholds that kill people. They're all over the Ninth Amendment. They've destroyed the right to bodily autonomy for women in this country by ending the protections of Roe v. Wade, and they're coming after gay marriage, and they're coming after our birth control. You can damn well bet that. They can't stand the 14th Amendment's grant of birthright citizenship to people in this country. They hate that idea. They can't stand the 15th Amendment that gave right to black people to vote, because they're constantly trying to racially gerrymander their maps in the southern states to dilute or eliminate black voters. They're constantly trying to eliminate polling places for black voters, set up laws to prevent them from even handing out water and snacks. And thank God the courts struck them down on that. They hate the 16th Amendment that established an income tax. They want to abolish that. They hate the 17th Amendment. I've actually heard some of these people talking about getting rid of the 17th Amendment. That's the one that allows us to directly elect our senators. They want to go back to allowing the state legislatures to appoint the senators, because they don't have enough of the lock on the Senate as it is with all the sparse rural white states. Occasionally a Montana gets uppity and elects a Democrat John Tester. No, they want to have the Montana legislature, overwhelmingly super majority Republican, selecting the next senators. They can't win through the votes, so they want to win through cheating. They hate the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote, because they want to do everything they can to take away women's rights. Don't think that that ain't coming soon. And of course, lately we've heard Vivek Ramaswamy and others saying we ought to not let anyone vote until they're 25 years old, which, hey, I'm fine with that. That's a great idea. 25 years old to vote, so long as it's 25 years old to enlist, 25 years old to drink alcohol, 25 years old to smoke pot, and 25 years old to buy a gun, and 25 years old before you're allowed to get married. Hey, I'm great with that. Set that as the age. But so long as you're going to send young men as young as 17 years old, that's right, you can sign up for the military at age 17 with your parents' permission. I did just that. You're going to send them to fight and die somewhere, then they should have the right to vote for who sends them to fight and die. I'm really sick of that side of the bird constantly shitting on our Constitution. So don't get caught up in all of this talk that it's two sides of the same coin or two wings of the same bird, because folks, in the United States, politics is binary. You can go ahead and be non-binary, whatever you want when it comes to gender. But when it comes to politics, there's Democrats and there's Republicans, and that's the choices you get. If you don't understand this, there's math behind it. Go Google Duverger's law, which basically states that single ballot majoritarian elections with single member districts tend to favor a two-party system. It's just the math. Don't hate the players, hate the game. If you really want some third-party action in the United States, you need to be working toward multi-member districts. You need to be working toward ranked choice voting. Until we change the rules of the game, the players will always be Republicans and Democrats. That's all you're going to get. Your third party is not going to win. It might make you feel better, but they're not going to win. A Republican or a Democrat can win, and you can either sit it out or help the party that at least knows how to govern win. At least Democrats bring us a better economy. At least Democrats don't hate on gays and minorities. It's way too important, this election coming up in 2024, to be sitting it out or to be voting a third-party protest vote. Two sides of the same coin? Hardly. One is much better on the economy. Two wings of the same bird? Hardly. One of those birds is shitting all over minorities. I'm Radical Russ, and that's the rant.